absolutely. Thank you, Nancy, for moderating, and thank you, Ingrid and Carrie, for those great comments. I also just want to thank Joan and HDF for bringing this issue up. I think it's very refreshing to look at a Fairfield County community that is, by evidence of the attendance here, quite aware that the challenges that face education go beyond just the classroom. And I think in Ingrid's presentation, you saw that was a very telling statistic of 20%, I believe, was how much time a child is spending within the classroom. And then the other 80%, I think, often is neglected, and when we look at improvements for education. So I want to thank Joan for bringing this up, because it allows us to talk about housing instability. So when you think about the mindset of the child, and you're concerned about the test score, well, if they have concerns about instability for housing, how could they possibly focus on such? The Stanford Public Education Foundation, which I have the privilege to serve as the Chief Executive Officer for, has the vision that each and every child will graduate inspired and prepared to be a productive member of society. And it's one of, I think, being very fortunate here in Fairfield County, one of many great community-based organizations that we have that addresses youth development. To give you some context of the organization, we're providing support to over 2,600 students. Our flagship program is called the Stanford Mentoring Program, where we're able to provide mentoring to 900 students. And it's really in that program where, when this opportunity to be part of this panel first came up, I really started to think about where those issues of housing instability have bubbled up for our foundation. And three areas came to mind, and some of it is echoing what Carrie has already mentioned, but we here, through our program, try to identify what we call learning barriers, which is whatever is preventing a student from reaching their full academic potential. And they're working with a mentor at the middle school level on a one-on-one basis to identify that. These are all students who have been identified by school personnel as needing additional academic or social support. And through those exercises, three stories really bubbled up to me that speak to housing instability. And one was a young girl who spoke to the challenge of having 7 people living in one apartment room. That's 7 people, 1 room, 1 bathroom, and the challenges that come with that, and her willingness to share that with a mentor versus her parents or her teacher or her administrator, I think, spoke to some of the work that community-based organizations can do in impacting a child's life. I think of another story where we had a young kid who was terrified because his mother was moving them from Stanford to the Bronx, New York, and his siblings were already in the Bronx, and he knew that they were all members of gangs, and that he was going to be forced into that environment, and that was something that was terrifying him as a 8th grade student. Another story comes to mind in this area of housing instability is the children that are forced to raise their siblings because of the stressors on parents to be able to work several jobs. So one young lady spoke to us about how she's providing the child care, and she's the one who's babysitting her siblings every day after school and cooking meals. So this is a 12-year-old who's taking on those responsibilities because of the strain that her mother had to work several jobs. And we want to talk to her about how to complete her English paper. Well, there's other issues that are at play here. So those are just 3 that really, for me, connect the dots to housing instability. But those are 3 stories in a city like Stanford, which we support, where there's 16,000 students, and a very richly diverse community, which we certainly celebrate. But with that comes challenges. So we have over 50% of our students that are economically disadvantaged, and without having specific data on it. I would venture to say there's much more because of the stigma for high school students to go and complete free and reduced lunch forms in order to get access to that. I would argue that that 50% number is much greater. In addition to that, we also have a significant amount, I believe the last count I saw was about 16% of our kids who are English language learners. We have over 60 languages spoken at home. So in terms of community-based organizations and actually the school system itself going and connecting with families to address some of these needs that go beyond the classroom, language barrier becomes a huge challenge as well. I think I've been quite pleased with our new superintendent, Mr. Kim, who's in his second year here in Stanford, with his approach through the strategic plan of really looking at kind of a holistic approach beyond just what takes place within the classroom, and the strategic plan being one focusing on a student's heart, mind, and body, I think speaks to some of the things we're talking about here, where it's not just test scores and what takes place in the classroom, but what other supports we can provide, you know, teachers like Carrie to be able to enhance the work that they do. I think of housing for the way it affects a youth, and it's so much part of their identity. It's so much part of, I live in Belltown, or I live on the west side, or I live on the east side. It dictates what school we go to, which our school as a youth is so much part of our identity as well. I'm from this school. I'm from Quinones. That's a Quinones boy, and I'll use Stanford schools to reference, or that's a Dolan kid. It's so much part of how they communicate. So when you talk about some of the challenges, even moving within the district that Carrie was touching on, you know, that affects their identity too. It's real fears that come out of that, and beyond just whether their parents can pay the rent, but are they going to just move again? Yeah, I've moved twice already, and I'm still in middle school. I've already lost friends from that move. Being transferred to another place where I'm not going to know anyone. This is anxiety, and I think that link when Ingrid spoke of kind of what can we do. Because as someone who wants to get to those answers, I'm very much concerned with that. And when you spoke about partnerships, I think there's some real challenges that touch on this issue, and when we look at partnerships for this, and one of them I wanted to just briefly mention is the challenge we have around data sharing. It becomes a huge hurdle. So think about the youth that went from one community to the next and was previously part of a Boys and Girls Club, or a place where they were really having that support because they were in that neighborhood. And the challenge that I think we have right now is, and I'll use a term that's common within the Strive and Cradle to Career initiative in Stanford, and similar ones in Bridgeport and Norwalk, which is in Stanford we are kind of program rich and system poor. And that data sharing, to me, really is a huge part of it. So we have some, as I mentioned earlier, terrific community-based organizations and a lot of wonderful donors and volunteers that really do want to make a difference here in the community in Stanford. But if we can't align our resources to be able to ensure that if a student starts at a breakfast program and there's information that a coordinator has at that point, how does that get to the teacher who's working with him during the day, and then the after-school program that might be tutoring him then, and then back into the home for the parent who's helping them with homework? That data sharing is a huge gap at this point that there are a tremendous amount of challenges around, and some of them are legal, and I'll hopefully get those from the lawyers. But in the meantime, I think the spirit of collaboration is something that we can strive for, and I think we get to that by having organizations who are in a position to fund community-based organizations, stressing collaboration and looking for that type of results from community-based service providers. In addition to that, each individual organization taking it upon themselves to ensure that they are going to collaborate. I think that creates that right environment so that when the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted from a legal standpoint for data sharing, that we're in a position to be able to do that. So I touched on a bit there, but I think I also just want to point out before I conclude and open it up for the Q&A is another challenge I see in our community is creating more equity amongst enrichment programming from school to school, so that if a child's true passion is that they play the trombone at a particular middle school and there's a phenomenal program there for them to do that, that if they do move, and so many of them do inter-district, that program is still available to them when they go to the next middle school, or that there's a building block for them from middle school to take that enrichment program and then do so much more at the high school level, that's not just dropped. So I think that continues to be a challenge for our community, certainly for our foundation, which has really 4 pillars in our approach, and enrichment programming is one of them. As you look at scalability for trying to grow programs, it's always a challenge to provide that equity amongst the schools. So we kind of try to start with one and then build from there. But to me, that creates another challenge in housing instability, to ensure that whatever supports are already in place, that it's the same across the board, hopefully within the same community and hopefully one day within the same county. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt.